Let me ask you a question. What do you picture when you hear the words Old West Town? A single dusty road, buildings lined up neatly on each side, the saloon right next to the jailhouse, sheriff's office across from the inn. You know the look, right? Now let me ask you something else. Where did that image come from? Chances are a movie, a cartoon, a TV show, something made for entertainment. Because the truth is, those iconic Old West towns, they weren't nearly that neat. No two towns were quite alike. The layouts were messy, the buildings often thrown together. It was a lot more wild than Hollywood lets on. If you're all about separating fact from fiction when it comes to the Wild West, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss our latest uploads. In this video, we're diving into what Old West towns really looked like, from their unpredictable layouts to the wildly diverse people who built them. Let's get into it. Where did this image come from? Before we go into more detail about what many Old West towns look like, we must first talk about the stereotypical depiction of a pioneer town. This idea didn't just spring up in a creative's head one day. It did have a basis in reality. One town that many Westerns got their inspiration from was Dodge City. It was a real place. Started as an immigrant settlement built in 1847 by civilians, the place was originally known as Fort Man. After the collapse, the U.S. Army offered protection, constructing Fort Atkinson on the site of Fort Man. However, it was shortly abandoned in 1853. From there, more military forces along the Santa Fe Trail would spring up around here, and another fort called Fort Larned eventually became vacant until the Civil War ended. Then after the war, Fort Dodge was constructed along with Fort Larned, offering protection along the Santa Fe Trail. Dodge City was built by Henry L. Sittler, who crafted a sod house to oversee cattle. Over time, more people saw the commercial possibilities due to its location near the Santa Fe Trail and the Arkansas River. With the construction of the Santa Fe Railroad, Dodge City was then erected along the western part of Fort Dodge. Have you ever said the phrase, "I'm getting out of Dodge"? That's where it comes from. Dodge City, Kansas, was indeed a place of lawlessness, and from that town sprang many legends, including Wyatt Earp, who became the deputy town marshal of the city. However, the newspapers at the time often wove together fact and fiction, making the city seem more lawless, romantic, and even exciting than it actually was. Shows such as Gunsmoke were set in Dodge City, adding to the town's mythos. It wasn't just Dodge City. Other towns, such as Tombstone, Arizona, inspired the Wild West media we're familiar with. That being said, these depictions paint only a small, distorted picture of what Old West life was like. Another reason many Old West towns look like this in media is convenience. Old movies and TV shows were built on sets. Many of these sets would be reused, and it was much easier to build a clean-looking town than one that reflected reality. In fact, many Old West towns were anything but clean. Disorder debunks design. First, many Old West towns didn't have the clean design the movies depict. These towns were often formed because of gold rushes, railroad construction, or cattle booms. Many times they were formed because that was where the money was, in the form of trails, railroads, or rivers. Because many of these towns would grow fast, they would have a bit of disorder in their appearance. Often, there was only so much usable land, so many buildings would be squeezed together, or streets wouldn't align right. Deadwood, South Dakota, is one such example. This town grew rapidly during the Black Hills Gold Rush, and it shows. These days, it is home to fossils and huge Gold Rush exhibits. But back then, that multitude of different buildings offered some of the most important necessities for all that came through there looking for gold. Even Tombstone, a town often romanticized, had a chaotic layout. Here is a fire insurance map that shows that the town was indeed a work in progress. Even the gallows, which were used to hang criminals and those who refused to uphold the law, were crammed in the corner of the courthouse. While only 7 men died here, that is still 7 too many. People did, however, crowd to get an intimate view of their men, who were sentenced to death for heinous crimes, including, but not limited to, murder. As these towns grew, so did their structure. Many towns that still stand today are more like you would expect from an organized town, but during the Wild West, their designs were just that wild. Not just in the town structure, but the materials used to build the town. Misconceptions about materials. So as these towns were being built, what do you picture the materials to be? If you're like most, you assume they're made from wood. Rarely do you think of an Old West building made from any other material than that. However, settlers often didn't have access to sound wood like we do in modern times. Instead, they used what they could find. Because of that, many towns often had buildings that could clash. In the southwestern states, such as New Mexico and Arizona, wood was often hard to find. Because of that, many homes were built from adobe or mud bricks. bricks. Most of the houses used adobe as you traveled further south. This material tended to use clay and sand mixed with water. Then a builder would use a binder. Sometimes the binder would be sticks or straw. Other times the dung from an animal would work as a binder. Imagine having a home made from cow manure. Luckily, it didn't smell too bad when it was dried. In the prairie regions, sod often worked as a material, creating sod houses where many buildings stood. These sod bricks may have weighed 50 pounds per brick and were a hassle to make. The resulting home had a top layer of soil on it, with grass growing from it. These homes almost look like something from The Lord of the Rings, but they were how people lived in these times. While they were quick and efficient to put together, they did have some drawbacks, including the presence of vermin, dampness, and damage caused by weather. In mining towns, stone and brick were often used as well because it was easily available. Bricks were used for hotels, saloons, and more permanent structures transported in from different areas. And with boom towns, many people set up camp using tents. Tents were not just for camping out. Some tents could double as saloons, barbershops, or other businesses. Take a look at this photo. As you can see, it's a tent next to a wooden home. This shows that Old West towns could have a diverse variety of buildings next to each other, as one settler had wood and the other had little more than the tent they brought with them. So yes, not every building in the Old West was alike. Many of them had unique materials and the styles often clashed. As these towns progressed and it was easier to obtain proper materials, many of them started to look a little uniform, but that was much later. Not every building was made from wood and had a tall facade. In fact, many facades in houses were, well, a facade. False fronts. Despite the chaotic nature of Western towns, many of them tried to make their buildings more impressive to travelers. This is what's known as a false front. This is where the building's facade would be vertical, uniform, and have an impressive design. This hid the fact that the building's interior may have been smaller than it looked. False fronts tended to hide the building's actual roof. Look at this photo. As you can see, the fronts of the buildings stand tall, proud, and uniform. However, the roofs are a little less so. Some of these roofs look uneven or like they could fall apart at any second. However, to someone who is facing the front of the building looks better than it actually is, which may be why you entered the store in the first place. Many movies depict Old West towns with these false fronts, but often don't show the true roofs. Also, the movies tended to show every building in a Western town as having this front when not all did. This is often due to the set design being much simpler if everything is uniform. Now that we've discussed buildings, let's talk about the streets. Let's talk about streets. It's time to get a little bit gross. Again, when you picture an Old West town, you're often thinking about one with a long dirt path. While dirt, it was usually evenly paved. However, this wasn't the case in reality. Streets could be muddy, stinky, and difficult for citizens to navigate. For example, a dirt road meant that when it rained, it got muddy. This made traveling through the town a journey where you needed to make sure you brought your boots. And while you should have cleaned off your shoes before you entered your businesses, people rarely did. So yes, they did trample through the streets and into these homes with mud, dirtying up many of the places in its wake. And in the Old West, what animal did people use for traveling? That's right, horses. Rarely did horse riders have a way to catch a horse's feces when the horse had to do their business. So often, the streets were covered with horse manure. After a while, you could get used to the smell. But as we said, not everyone wiped their boots when entering a building. So you're not only tracking in the mud, but also a little surprise as well. Another problem with the manure was the bacteria within these droppings. Many people would get sick from this manure. Not to mention, manure attracts flies and other bugs. So this added more disease and disgust to these towns. It makes sense why many people would get sick so easily with all the nasty critters around. And this wasn't the time when we had a power hose and pest control. Until the invention of cars, this problem lasted in many Old West towns. It was a part of life to step into who knows what as you went to grab your groceries, get a drink, or even sleep at an inn. Some towns did add boardwalks to their buildings to contain this problem somewhat, but these were a luxury, not the norm. If a business had high traffic or there was a busy strip, one could dismount their horse and walk through these boardwalks, but for the most part, they were in the muck like the rest of the citizens, and these citizens could come from all walks of life. Culture diversity. Now, what do you think of when you picture the racial makeup of an Old West town? Chances are, you picture nothing but white men and women with a band of Native Americans invading the town on occasion. If there was ever a black person, they were a slave. However, many Old West towns were quite diverse. We already mentioned the adobe buildings, which Mexican and indigenous builders often built, but many other cultures could be found in the Old West, showing that it was a bit more of a melting pot than you may have thought. For example, if you visited the town of John Day Oregon, you may have come across the Kamwa Chung and Company building. This building was where the Chinese community would gather, and it served as a grocery dry goods store, clinic, temple, and much more. It was the original Chinatown for Chinese immigrants. Not something you would think you'd see every day, but since immigration across the Pacific did happen, these people were able to build and start their lives here in the Old West. Another example is in Nicodemus, Kansas. The Nicodemus Historic Site shows the remains of this town founded by black settlers during Reconstruction. This town was named after a black slave in the story Wake Nicodemus by Henry Clay Work. The town symbolized freed slaves who tried to form their own society after experiencing generations of oppression. It wasn't just non-whites, however. Many Old West towns had settlers from European countries. Census data from states such as Oklahoma shows that a town could get immigrants from Austria, Switzerland, Wales, and many other European countries. Many of these people moved to the West for new opportunities, political crises, or just to get a new start in life, similar to how they did in Ellis Island a century after. Some of these places survived for a long time and are still here to this day as family-owned businesses that lasted generations. While the people may have been white, their culture and native tongue could be very different from those of the original settlers. As such, they added their own bit of diversity to these growing towns. These towns sparked the flames of diversity for the Old West, and it just goes to show that these old towns are not as homogeneous as you'd expect. Instead, there are many cultures that prided themselves in some unique and different perspectives that helped shape these cultures. With the movies, remember, they are just that, movies. Even if they're historical fiction, these movies are often coming from a romanticized look at the past. As a result, you get clean-looking towns where everything looks uniform. But the Old West wasn't like that. Not every citizen was alike. Many towns came from different materials, and cities weren't often as structured as you'd think. Things could get gross with all the horse manure and mud around, tracked not only into the saloons and sheriff's office, but also into ordinary houses as well. A mixture of Hollywood convenience, newspapers romanticizing events, and our tendency to view the past with rose-colored glasses gave us the stereotypical Old West look we know today. However, the truth is more exciting. Old West towns lack symmetry, but they certainly had soul. With that said, we hope you learned something about Old West towns. Once again, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications so you'll be the first to know when a video drops. Also, leave a comment. Did you know that Old West towns did not look like they did in the movies? What's the most mind-blowing misconception about the Old West you know of? Let us know.